Hello and welcome. My name is Jonathan Streff. I'm a park ranger at John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site. And welcome to a series that we are doing entitled The New Frontier and the Great Society, an examination of the lives, presidencies, and legacies of JFK and LBJ. And joining me today is Joe from LBJ National Historical Park. Joe, how are you, sir?
Doing good, doing good.
Good to see you. So we are going to roll right into episode 5. Over the course of this series, we've been examining the lives of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, literally from the start of their lives, looking at their great-grandparents. And today we're going to kind of get to the meat of the matter. We're going to talk about first the presidency of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So we'll kick off with the very first question. And Joe, we'll have you answer this one first. Why was Johnson selected as John Fitzgerald Kennedy's vice president?
A large part of it is because Lyndon Johnson represented the South. He's from Texas, considered part of the South, and President Kennedy or Senator Kennedy knew back then that he needed the South's support to become president. And Lyndon Johnson represented the South. He was the Senate Majority Leader. He knew a lot of he knew every single Southern senator and representative. And I believe President Kennedy, on the advice of multiple people, including his father, Joseph, understood that if he got Lyndon Johnson on board, that he had a really good chance of winning the presidency in 1960. I believe that was pretty much the major part.
Yeah, I agree with you absolutely. And I think at the end of the day, it's been interesting to sort of examine the sort of complicated nature of how that all went down. But at the end of the day, as you were suggesting, it was Jack Kennedy's call to ask him to be VP. And Johnson, Joe, as you're well aware, was not so keen on it at first. He looked at the vice presidency as a huge step down. His dream from 13 years onward really was to become president of the United States. And so he very much kind of calculated his political weight here at this moment in time. We'll go to the second question. So what was the relationship like between JFK and LBJ? Obviously, you have a relationship that exists prior to the presidency. They're both in the United States Senate at the first time. LBJ is 9 years older than Jack Kennedy with significantly more legislative experience. But what was their relationship like? Let's talk a bit about that.
I think in Congress, I think Senator Johnson understood how popular Jack Kennedy was. He was charismatic. He was just a young, vibrant senator. And I believe Senator Johnson knew right away that Jack Kennedy might be a political rival. Now, Johnson had the power. He was the powerful senator. He was the master of the Senate. But Jack Kennedy represented the future. And I think Lyndon Johnson understood it and knew that that was what was going to happen. And they didn't have much really personal contact with each other. They saw each other. They might have worked together behind the scenes on some legislation, but Lyndon Johnson was the old guard. He knew he was part of Sam Rayburn's group. He was part of Richard Russell's group. And it was just an age conflict. Like you said, it was 9-year difference. And so Lyndon Johnson represented the old part of the Senate, the old Dixiecrats. And here we had a charismatic young John Kennedy from the Northeast. And it was just a surprise to Lyndon Johnson how popular, I believe, at first, how popular Jack Kennedy was. And I think he understood that this is a man to contend with, maybe for the presidency in 1960.
Yeah, I think you made a number of really great points there. I think what's interesting about their relationship is at first, I think on some level, LBJ underestimated Jack Kennedy, sort of looked at him as a flash in the pan. As we talked about in the previous episode, LBJ was certainly a much more seasoned legislator, was a much more seasoned politician in many respects, but Kennedy sort of represented this new guard, bringing the youth in, bringing folks in who had not been involved in politics as much as LBJ's generation was. And so I think he saw very quickly, though, especially when he kind of came late to the party in terms of his interest in the 1960 campaign, LBJ began to realize the sort of machine that Kennedy was able to bring to the table and his ability to get those delegates when they're at the convention in Los Angeles. But as I think you suggested, he quickly realized that Kennedy was brilliant. He was very savvy. Their personalities were very different in many respects. but I think at the same time, he kind of picked up on things. Once John F. Kennedy does win the presidency and LBJ is vice president, I think, as you're probably well aware, there was a level of depression that LBJ went through in terms of gaining the vice presidency, but feeling as though he had gained nothing. And I find it really interesting to sort of see these two men sort of operating with each other. As you mentioned, in the Senate, they were not compadres per se. And LBJ always talks about that Jack Kennedy respected him in the White House, tried to give him his due. But I think, Joe, it's quite clear that other members of President Kennedy's administration were not quite as kind and as respectful to LBJ. Why don't you talk a little about that? What's that dynamic like?
Well, I think Lyndon Johnson, he was surprised to be vice president. I think he was surprised to be asked, because when he really understood he was not going to get the nomination, I think he was going to resign himself to be back in Texas and just pretty much just retire from politics, which for Lyndon Johnson was hard to do. But when John Kennedy offered him the chance to be the vice president, there was a chance to be kind of in the ballgame again. I think Lyndon Johnson knew right away, though, that he would lose a lot of power, upfront power. Now, behind the scenes, of course, he still had power, but he thought that John Kennedy was shuffling him to the side because Lyndon Johnson would be in the office, in the Oval Office, and he'd be right there. But President Kennedy really didn't look at him that much. He asked a lot more advice from his brother, Bobby Kennedy. And Lyndon Johnson was resentful of that. And right away, you could see the hostility between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. They really did not like each other personally. And I think Lyndon Johnson was resentful to President Kennedy. It's like, hey, I'm the vice president, but you're not asking me anything. You want me to go on these foreign trips to just get out of Washington, D.C. and get out of the way. But at the same time, he understood that John Kennedy was a smart man. He was a man that could get things done as well. Like I said, he represented the future of the Democratic Party. He represented the future of when he was even in Congress, but especially as president. So I really think that Lyndon Johnson thought he was getting shuffled to the side. I don't even know if he really thought he would be the nominee again in 1964. I mean, to be the vice presidential nominee, I think he was very concerned about that. I don't know who President Kennedy would have selected if he would not have been killed in 1963. But I think I believe Lyndon Johnson knew right away that it was not going to be a good chance for him to be vice president in 1964. I think he thought maybe President Kennedy might want him on board to get the Southern votes again. But I think at the same time, he understood he was getting out of the ballgame. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy would be there in the room with his staff, and he really didn't call on Lyndon Johnson, even though Lyndon Johnson knew the international scene very well. He was a Senate Majority Leader. He had to work with Foreign Relations Committee. And I think he really wanted to input a lot more, especially on international decisions, than he did. And he really thought maybe President Kennedy was not going to ask him for his advice, that he had better intelligent individuals on his staff. Lyndon Johnson was very intimidated about that. He said that, John Kennedy has all these intellectuals from Harvard and Yale, and he doesn't really need to talk to me because he probably thinks that I'm not as smart as the other staff members, even Pierre Solinger. And just really thought he was intimidated by John Kennedy's intelligence too. Now, Lyndon Johnson was a smart man, very smart man. He wanted to be the Senate Majority Leader if he wasn't. But I think he understood that John Kennedy got along and understood a lot better people from the same region that he was from and not from Texas.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I think what's quite interesting, and I want to talk a bit more about the relationship between Bobby and LBJ, but, as you said, I think LBJ was very conscious of his background, as we've talked about in previous episodes too. He's had a tremendous fear of failure, despite the fact that he's had such tremendous success, that he really is coming from a humble background and rises to become arguably the second most powerful person in the United States, the Senate Majority Leader. So as you were suggesting, it's definitely a step down. But members of President Kennedy's administration very much looked down on him. They had all sorts of awful nicknames for him. Bobby Kennedy in particular really despised LBJ. And frankly, I think the feelings were mutual. What I think is interesting is that you have, and Robert Caro, I think, does a pretty solid job of having a conversation about that in many respects, Bobby Kennedy and LBJ are similar in the sense that they both have very powerful personalities rather, but at the same time, the way that they interact with people, where LBJ is very much kind of in your face and backslapping and handshaking, and Bobby Kennedy's very sort of taken aback. Bobby Kennedy too, the very first time that they met, when Bobby Kennedy was on Joe McCarthy's committee, there's a scene where LBJ would walked into the cafeteria, the Senate cafeteria, and Bobby Kennedy did not get up, wouldn't shake his hand, but a lot of that's coming from the insults that Bobby Kennedy had heard about his father, Joe, and that would continue on, as you're well aware, Joe. Bobby Kennedy is going to try to make sure that LBJ does not get on the ticket, goes down to the hotel room 3 separate times, which makes for some very interesting drama. And unfortunately, that animosity is really going to shape a lot of the inner workings of politics going on. So just to step back for a second, I think as you were kind of getting at too, LBJ kind of goes back and forth, I think, between having these moments of influence and then other moments where he feels like, as you said, being shoved to the side. And it's again, he has all this insight he brings to the table. There was one incident I was reading about, you mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Bobby and Jack had left, the president, I should say, had left the meeting, and LBJ had begun to kind of steer folks in a slightly more hawkish direction. And as we've talked about before, it's his power, his personality, but also his knowledge and his ability to make convincing arguments. So there's a lot of that going on. Let's get to the next question. And Joe, you sort of answered this a little bit already, but what sort of roles, even though he kind of gets pushed to the side, there are a couple specific roles that Johnson's going to take on as vice president. And how did he try to shape the direction of the Kennedy presidency through these roles that he has?
Well, I think a lot of the conversations that President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson had would be directly affected today is the civil rights. I know that Lyndon Johnson, even back in the early stages of the vice presidency, he had an idea how important civil rights was. I think he always knew that somehow, some way, he wanted to be involved in getting the Civil Rights Bill of 1965 passed. John Kennedy was wanting to get the Civil Rights Bill passed, his version of the Civil Rights passed. I think there was a lot of closed meetings maybe that they had that didn't really advertise a lot. But I think Lyndon Johnson also tried to show Jack Kennedy how the Senate really worked behind the scenes. I mean, for 20 plus years, Lyndon Johnson was in the Senate, and Senator Kennedy was still kind of relatively new to the way the Senate was. He didn't know the Sam Rayburn kind of deals, going behind the scenes and going out to like establishments or back rooms and having a drink and talking to fellow senators, informally. Back then, even Tip O'Neill said that, he'd spent many hours with Jack Kennedy and with Lyndon Johnson behind the scenes talking about, what should we do about this, civil rights, or maybe international policy with Vietnam. And so I think it was more of a indirect back room kind of relationship if they did talk international scenes and stuff like that. I really don't think Bobby Kennedy would have put up with much about being there in the kind of room, because like you said, he did not like Lyndon Johnson and vice versa. I mean, he would openly sneer at LBJ, and LBJ would, just like him, kind of right back. But I think Lyndon Johnson tried to steer President Kennedy with the civil rights. I believe that was the major thing. And for Lyndon Johnson, that was a big risk, because he was still considered a powerful Dixiecrat. He never voted against his fellow Southern senators, and he just bided his time. But I believe he also told, John Kennedy, this is a good chance for us to pass this bill, because like I said, Lyndon Johnson knew the Senate like the back of his hand.
Yeah, I think probably one of the most interesting aspects, you sort of hinted at this, is that, again, obviously both President Kennedy and Bobby, as a committee member, did spend a fair amount of time in the U.S. Senate, but at the same time, LBJ knew the ins and outs. He knew what to do, and there's the great conversation as the civil rights legislation is being introduced, and Jack Kennedy says to LBJ, "What should we do?" And he kind of outlines it, and to a certain extent, that advice is ignored, which I find really, really interesting. Just to go back for 1 minute, though, you mentioned the relationship between Bobby and LBJ, and I think you're spot on in the sense that Bobby is going to have a lot of influence on his brother, particularly in terms of how much they listen to Lyndon Johnson. But George Reedy, who eventually became LBJ's press secretary, has talked about that relationship as two dogs coming into a room, and they kind of, the hair on the back of their neck goes up and there's like a low growl. So it does give you some idea of kind of the very rough nature of things. Obviously, LBJ too is going to be involved with the space program with NASA, which will become part of one of John F. Kennedy's initiatives. LBJ, of course, picked that up once he becomes president, and nearly sailed that the way through when we had the moonshot in '69. I want to talk a bit about John F. Kennedy's presidency. Obviously, it's a relatively short time. John F. Kennedy's only in office for a little bit over 1,000 days, but there are some pretty significant moments and events that occur during that time period. And I think you have to start with John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. We've talked a bit about that before, which is really a call to service, but also a warning to the Soviet Union to not to expand, whether that's in Europe or Southeast Asia, and very much kind of putting on the table that the United States is willing to meet them and be in conflict if need be. Simultaneously, though, you have the creation of the Peace Corps, which is kind of the soft arm of the Cold War. We're sending out young people around the world to engage in programs that will help folks in some way, shape, or form to improve areas. So again, John F. Kennedy goes to Rice University in 1962, and of course makes the speech talking about going to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And as we've talked about before, and as we'll talk about in a future episode, he very much starts to put civil rights on the federal agenda. A lot of that's reactive, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. There's also, you have huge flashpoints in the Cold War as well, where you have crises in Berlin, you have the Bay of Pigs invasion in the spring of 1962, which occurs very early on and really does some damage to President Kennedy's credibility, but simultaneously he takes responsibility for that. But then that also simultaneously kind of sets up the context for the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets and the Cubans were fearful of an invasion, so they began to place offensive missiles on the island of Cuba, which sets up a 13-day crisis, which, Joe, as you're well aware, we came this close to nuclear war. Yeah. And between John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, and I would argue LBJ and other members of the administration, you have a very careful response to that crisis, and ultimately that ends peacefully. And so in the aftermath of that, you do have John F. Kennedy reconsidering the Cold War rhetoric. And so on the same day, he actually makes this famous speech about civil rights. Earlier that day, he goes to American University and for the first time sort of acknowledges the humanity of people in the Soviet Union. For the first time acknowledges that these folks sacrificed more than any other nation during the course of the Second World War, and tries to separate the ideology from the individual, and talks about in the final analysis, we all breathe the same air. We all wish the best for our future. So this is all happening summer of 1963. As we've talked about before, John F. Kennedy, his life will be taken in November of 1963. There's always speculation as to what would have happened had he lived, et cetera. But we're going to focus on what actually did happen in future episodes. So again, I think probably the biggest legacy of John F. Kennedy's presidency is the hope and inspiration that he sends out, and the summoning to people to engage in public service, and some of the things I listed. Joe, anything you want to add to that at all?
No, I would agree 100% with you. You know, John F. Kennedy, like I said, represented the future, the hopes, the aspirations of getting things done that were difficult. And I believe Lyndon Johnson really admired his foresight and his dreams, and he wanted to get on board with that. I believe he really thought that was some good things for not only the country, but for the entire world. And so I think he just, nodded and said, yeah, I definitely agree with what President Kennedy says. And not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It makes it a challenge, but it's something to always be remembered. Lyndon Johnson wanted to be remembered. That's one thing he always wanted to do. And I believe with President Kennedy's policies, even if President Kennedy would have lived, well, Vice President Johnson would want to be part of that team. he wanted to be known as, yeah, I was part of that as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think what's interesting too, just to kind of add on to the statement you made in regards to LBJ wanted to be remembered. JFK did too. As someone who had studied history for most of his life, he was very much aware of, which is why we have all these recordings, and we can talk more about the LBJ recording a little bit later on. But John F. Kennedy, I think, was always very conscious about his place, the place of his administration in history, and was hoping to leave the place better than he found it. So, all right. Well, Joe, we're just about out of time, and so that's going to end this episode. But I really appreciate the conversation, and I want to thank you for joining us today. So, folks, we will be back for the next episode, Transformation Out of Tragedy, the Presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson. Thanks, and take care.